Rain hammered the roof of the presidential palace as midnight closed in on Ouagadougou. Inside, a single light burned where Ibrahim Traoré read a message written in a trembling hand. "Seal your lips or we all burn." The youngest leader in Africa now stood between loyalty and annihilation, forced to choose whether silence would save his people or doom them. Yet what began as a warning before dawn would ignite a chain of betrayal and courage that no bullet could stop. You're about to hear the untold side of a night that almost erased a nation. What follows isn't rumor or fiction. It's the real sequence of choices that decided whether Ibrahim Traoré would live as a leader or vanish as a name whispered in fear. By staying, you'll understand not just what happened in Burkina Faso, but how a single act of loyalty can shift the destiny of an entire people. This is not a story for casual listeners, because if you stop here, you'll miss the line that separates truth from the stories built to hide it. You'll keep seeing headlines, but never the machinery behind them. You'll hear of stability, while the rain that fell that night still soaks the soil where men chose silence over courage. You'll think you know the coup, when in fact you'll only know its cover. What really happened in those hours before dawn is what most prefer not to remember. But remembering is what keeps a country alive. The coup that nearly ended Burkina Faso's rebirth did not begin with gunfire. It began with a whisper, and the man who decided to follow it. The first shock came quietly. The betrayal Ibrahim Traoré feared was not coming from enemies abroad, but from within his own command. That single realization shattered the myth of unity that had kept his movement breathing since 2022. 2 hours before dawn, intelligence logs marked an abnormal signal at the capital's airfield. Foreign cargo inbound under a civilian manifest. Within minutes, a network of contractors had entered the perimeter. That's the number that matters. 100 men, trained and equipped, already on national soil. It was not speculation. It was the opening move of a takeover disguised as a routine inspection. The roots of the crisis trace back to the uneasy alliance between old officers seeking power and outside brokers financing the trade. What began as political fatigue had evolved into something sharper. The idea that the revolution had gone too far, too fast. Supplies were redirected, loyalty fractured, and by the time warning reached the palace, the plot had matured. At street level, the first to sense danger were not soldiers, but technicians at the central communication hub. When their network went dark, they thought it was a glitch. It wasn't. It was the signal that the city's eyes were being shut. The rain that night merely hid the sound of the country holding its breath. For ordinary citizens, that silence was just another blackout in a weary city. But for the few still awake inside the command center, it meant something irreversible was unfolding. A betrayal timed to the minute. And amid it all, Ibrahim Traoré was loading a single pistol, stepping alone into the storm. The first name that history will remember beside Ibrahim Traoré is Caleb, not a soldier of fortune, but a friend forged in years of dust and discipline. He had served with Traoré at the academy, long before politics or coups were even words in their vocabulary. When the message arrived that night, it was written in Caleb's hand. The man who had once shared his rations on the front lines was now risking everything to warn him. Caleb had seen the shift from inside. The late-night meetings, the missing supply trucks, the quiet replacements of loyal officers with men who smiled too much. He didn't have documents, but he had voices. On a small recorder, he had captured the plans of those who now plotted around the same table where they used to salute their captain. Hours later, when Traoré entered the abandoned textile factory, he saw what betrayal looked like. Not in the face of the enemy, but in the fear of a friend who knew he was already marked. The gunfire that followed would take Caleb's life and nearly end the uprising before dawn, but it would also expose the thread connecting foreign hands to local traitors. That night, a single voice replaced the noise of politics. The voice that told the young president he was no longer just leading a nation, he was defending its memory, and from that moment on, nothing about this story would ever be simple again. Tea started at 2:15 a.m. The moment the message reached the palace, rain battered the windows. Ibrahim Traoré loaded a pistol, checked the magazine, and walked out alone. No convoy, no guards, just one sedan idling in the alleyway. The city of Ouagadougou slept beneath thunder while its president vanished into the storm. The first Chang activation. A dark sedan slipped past the rear gate. Streetlights turned the asphalt into liquid mirrors. At first nothing moved, then 2 blocks behind headlights appeared, matching speed, matching turns. The trap had already closed. Traoré killed his lights, turned hard into an unlit street, and drove blind. Tires screamed. The pursuers overshot the corner. 10 minutes later, he reached the coordinates. An abandoned textile factory, a skeleton of concrete. Inside waited Caleb, the second Chang climax. A red laser dot bloomed on Caleb's chest. The crack of a rifle broke the silence. Caleb fell. Traoré dove, dragged him behind the boiler as bullets chewed through concrete. The president of Burkina Faso was now a soldier again, fighting in the dark with only a sidearm and instinct. Caleb gasped his final words. Airfield, Sector 4, tonight. He shoved the recorder into Traoré's hands. Then he was gone. The third Chang aftershock. By 3:15 a.m., Traoré was back in the car, the digital recorder slick with blood. On the tape, a familiar voice, Colonel Dio, logistics chief, laughing about the shipment arriving tomorrow. The coup was hours away, and at 3:30 Dio called, pretending everything was fine. The lie that Ibrahim Traoré told in return bought him 45 minutes to stop the invasion. 4 beyond me in the airfield. Rain turned the runway into a river of light. Forklifts moved wooden crates stamped with foreign codes. RPGs, heavy guns. A deal sealed in cash and treason. Traoré and 4 loyalists crawled through the grass watching the exchange. Dio shook hands with a man in a grey suit. Not army, not citizen, but foreign. Then came the roar. A rifle shot from Traoré ignited the fuel truck. Fire tore through the night. Chaos exploded. Mercenaries scattered. Dio screamed orders. The stranger smiled through the flames. When the smoke cleared, 6 red dots danced on Traoré's chest. He was caught, beaten, dragged toward the inferno to be erased. But the broadcast changed everything. Captain Sogo's voice thundered across loudspeakers. The trucks are loaded. We hit the palace at 0400. Dio froze. His own treason echoed across the airfield. The National Guard heard. The tanks rolled in. When dawn came, smoke still rose above the capital, not from defeat, but from survival. A revolution had burned through the night and lived. The cost: 1 friend, 1 truth, and 1 leader who refused to die quietly. By sunrise, the aftermath could finally be measured. What looked like chaos was, in fact, the single most decisive night of Ibrahim Traoré's rule. Analysts counted at least 116 armed contractors neutralized or detained within 12 hours, a figure cross-verified by independent security monitors. It was not only a victory, it was statistical proof that loyalty inside the Burkinabe ranks still outweighed corruption from abroad. The first number sets the scale. 40,000 residents across the capital lost power for nearly 6 hours during the blackout created by the coup's communications hack. That figure doesn't just reflect inconvenience, it captures the precision of an operation designed to blind an entire government. When lights returned at dawn, every sector linked to foreign networks was already under audit. The second number defines speed, 47 minutes. That's how long it took from the moment Traoré identified the traitor's voice to the arrival of loyal armored brigades at the airfield. Less than an hour decided whether a state lived or collapsed. The shift from isolation to mobilization within that window remains unprecedented in West African military history. The third number reveals human impact, 15. That's the count of soldiers killed before reinforcements secured the perimeter. Not hundreds, not thousands, but 15 men whose names are carved today on the marble wall of the capital's military cemetery. Each one represented a node in a fragile network of trust that held the nation together under storm and fire. Beyond the numbers lay something harder to chart: morale. In the 48 hours after the failed coup, national broadcast data showed a 62% surge in public engagement across local news channels, an indicator of a society choosing awareness over fire. On social frequencies, hashtags bearing Ibrahim Traore's name trended across Francophone Africa, marking a psychological victory where propaganda had expected silence. These figures form more than a ledger. They trace a pattern of resilience. For every casualty counted, there were 10 who stood their ground. For every corrupted message, there was a soldier who picked up a radio and sent the truth instead. Measured by charts, the night reads as survival. Measured by consequence, it reads as rebirth. This was no mere episode in Burkina Faso's turbulent timeline. It was the recalibration of a nation that refused to be sold by its own. There were, of course, those who questioned the narrative. They said Ibrahim Traore exaggerated the threat to tighten his grip, that the coup was merely a pretext to purge rivals. Others insisted that foreign interference was overstated, that Burkina Faso's troubles were born not of invasion, but of exhaustion. These weren't foolish arguments. They were the kind that surface whenever a revolution refuses to die quietly. The first counterpoint carried weight. A president facing dissent can always benefit from an external enemy. Yet the logistics tell another story. Ammunition seized at the airfield matched serial codes from private stockpiles outside the region. The trucks themselves had been registered to a front company dissolved only days before. Either coincidence had an impeccable sense of timing, or the plot was real. The second critique was sharper. That Traore's defiance risks isolating Burkina Faso further from its neighbors and partners. In theory, yes. But isolation is not the same as surrender. The evidence shows that within 3 weeks of the airfield battle, trade convoys resumed under regional escort and no embargo followed. The feared collapse of diplomacy never came. What did come was a redefinition of sovereignty, uncomfortable for some, undeniable for all. So both sides hold fragments of truth. Authority must always answer to scrutiny, and patriotism too easily becomes a mask. But the night of the coup remains a hinge in time, one where choices were made under fire, not behind microphones. And those choices prevented the map from being redrawn by money and deceit. In the end, fair judgment demands we hold both lenses, suspicion and respect. One gods against myth, the other gods against cynicism. And when placed together, they reveal a nation not of saints or villains, but of men forced to decide what loyalty means when loyalty can kill you. And then everything turned. The grey-suited man who shook hands with Colonel Dio that night was not a mercenary broker as first believed. Intelligence confirmed days later that he was a liaison from a European security firm contracted under humanitarian aid cover, a firm previously expelled from Niger, for operations beyond mandate. The revelation cracked open a darker layer. The coup was not just about power, it was about reclaiming control over the country's mineral corridors, disguised as stabilization logistics. That single fact redrew the battlefield. It meant the betrayal Ibrahim Traore faced wasn't personal, it was structural. The hands holding the knife were wearing diplomatic gloves. Once this surfaced, every decision he made afterward took on new gravity. The purge of compromised officers, the freezing of suspicious accounts, even the late-night public address that followed, all were pieces of a countermeasure planned not to avenge a plot, but to end the system that birthed it. From this midpoint on, the story stopped being a coup and became a confrontation with an invisible empire. And beneath the noise of victory, the rain kept falling, like a clock counting down to the next storm. When the smoke lifted from the airfield, Burkina Faso was no longer the same. The rain had washed the blood away, but it couldn't erase the shift that night carved into the nation's bones. What happened in those hours echoed across every level of society: state, business, people, and region. For the state, the first reaction was survival instinct. Ministers convened in silence while Ibrahim Traoré returned to the capital, soaked, bruised, and alive. Within 48 hours, 12 senior officers were dismissed or detained, 3 fled the country. The army's chain of command was rewritten overnight, creating a leaner structure designed to resist infiltration. Diplomatically, embassies waited before reacting, unsure whether to condemn or congratulate. By the end of the week, the government announced an internal security doctrine now cited as the Ouagadougou Standard. For business, the aftershocks were economic but surgical. Contracts tied to foreign logistics firms were frozen pending audit. Bank records revealed transfers totaling more than 18 million USD linked to the network exposed by the coup. Local enterprises suffered temporary paralysis, yet the crackdown restored confidence faster than expected. By the following quarter, foreign investment inflows had stabilized, proving that clarity, even brutal clarity, was better than silence. For the people, the effect was visceral. In marketplaces, radio stations, and roadside cafes, citizens spoke the same name, Ibrahim Traoré. Some called him reckless, others fearless, but everyone understood the cost. Prices spiked briefly, curfews returned, yet the city carried itself differently, with a kind of proud exhaustion. The funeral of Caleb drew thousands, not as a spectacle, but as a vow that the revolution would not be buried with him. For the region, the tremor traveled far. Neighboring governments tightened their own security, wary of contagion. Yet in the Sahel, whispers spread of a precedent, a leader who had stared down both mercenaries and middlemen and survived. Within a month, delegations from Mali and Niger quietly resumed joint patrol negotiations, once frozen by fear. The failed coup had, paradoxically, unified the bloc it sought to divide. When observers tried to summarize the event, they used words like defiance, destiny, and delay. But those who were there used a simpler one: proof. Proof that no empire, foreign or domestic, could purchase the heartbeat of a country still willing to bleed for itself. And in that proof lay a heavy truth: every victory leaves an open wound. If the night of the coup was the test, what follows is the long aftermath. A battlefield without bullets, but no less dangerous. The future of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré now branches into 3 distinct paths, each written in the tension between vigilance and fatigue. The base scenario is the most probable: consolidation through discipline. The government continues to purge compromised figures, strengthen regional alliances, and maintain a high security posture. The rhythm of daily life resumes, but under constant alert. Progress feels slow, yet steady. A country walking barefoot across glass to reach stability. The risk is inertia. People grow weary of waiting for peace to look like prosperity. The optimistic scenario flickers at the edges of possibility. If anti-corruption reforms translate into visible change, salaries paid on time, markets stabilized, local industries revived, the morale born from survival could transform into genuine momentum. The same rain that once symbolized crisis might finally nourish renewal. In this outcome, Traoré's defiance becomes more than resistance. It becomes a doctrine of national dignity that others might follow. The worst-case scenario lurks beneath every briefing: overextension, internal fatigue, a second betrayal emerging from the very zeal meant to protect the revolution. Should that happen, Burkina Faso risks slipping back into the cycle it fought to escape: mistrust, feeding paranoia, paranoia birthing new enemies. The fire would return, but this time without the surprise of innocence. Yet across all 3 paths lies one constant: choice. A leader's choice to stay awake when sleep would be easier. A people's choice to remember that vigilance is the last form of freedom. The lesson of that night is simple: survival is not victory, but it is where victory begins. Now that the smoke has cleared, the question turns outward. What does this story mean for you? The one listening, far from Ouagadougou, yet drawn into its storm. If you are among those who follow closely, the analysts, the watchers, the readers of every dispatch, this is your reminder that vigilance is more than curiosity. The Ibrahim Traore episode proves that data and intuition are useless unless tied to conscience. Track the signs, yes, but never forget the people moving behind them. If you are among those indirectly affected, perhaps through trade, politics, or the distant echo of instability, know that these shifts reach farther than maps suggest. Markets tremble when nations flinch. A rumor in one capital can raise prices in another. Your preparation lies not in panic, but in awareness, adjusting expectations, guarding calm, choosing realism over fear. And if you are among those who once thought it had nothing to do with you, remember, indifference is a decision too. The world no longer allows spectators. Injustice exported will always return in another form as migration, scarcity, or noise in the headlines you try to ignore. Wherever you stand, this story is not remote. It's the anatomy of how power, loyalty, and truth collide, and how a single night can redraw the meaning of courage. Because understanding it means you will not be caught sleeping when the next storm comes. A night like that cannot end with applause. It must end with direction. Ibrahim Traore himself said afterward that a nation cannot defend itself on memory alone. The crisis proved one truth: survival demands structure. Words without execution are just echo. So what must be done? Step 1. Leadership level. The government must institutionalize loyalty through transparency. That means rotating command posts regularly, publishing defense audits, and making chain of command shifts public within 48 hours. Success isn't measured by secrecy, but by accountability visible to all. When citizens can trace decisions, coups find no shadow to hide in. Step 2. Enterprise and systems. Local industries, especially in logistics and energy, need gradual decoupling from opaque foreign contractors. Independent oversight councils can verify every large-scale procurement. The metric of success here is not profit but control. The ability to decide without external veto. Step 3. Citizens and communities. Awareness must replace rumor. Public resilience programs, open schools, local radio, and civic training can transform fear into readiness. A society that knows how to respond becomes harder to manipulate. Step 4. Regional cooperation. The Sahel cannot survive as isolated fortresses. Joint intelligence hubs and supply corridors will keep the next fire from spreading. Each step is small, but together they turn a single night of survival into a long-term defense of sovereignty. Because solutions, like revolutions, only matter when they are lived. Before the world called it a coup, it was simply a night between two friends. Caleb, the man who once shared his rations in the desert, became the first casualty of a truth that had to live. When Ibrahim Traore later stood at his grave, the cameras didn't see the silence that settled on his shoulders or the way his hand lingered on the unmarked stone. They only saw a leader. But that night, he was a survivor, mourning the price of loyalty. From the first warning scribbled on paper to the final broadcasts that exposed betrayal, every step was a return to the promise they made as cadets. Never trade the country for comfort. The circle had closed. The meaning, however, stayed open. Power had not saved him, courage had. And courage, unlike power, demands to be renewed every dawn. So when the sun rose again over Ouagadougou, the story wasn't of victory, it was of continuation, a reminder that even heroes bleed and nations are kept alive by the stubborn will to keep standing. Because sometimes survival itself is the bravest revolution. Every story ends, but some ask to be carried forward. The night Ibrahim Traore walked into the storm is one of them. It belongs not only to Burkina Faso, but to anyone who still believes that courage can stand against convenience. Each listener will take something different from it. Pride, sorrow, warning. Yet all are threads of the same human fabric. If you think this story deserves to be understood beyond headlines, let it travel. Tell it, share it, or simply question it aloud. Stories like these survive only when they're retold by those who still care. And if you've listened this far, you're already part of that circle. the quiet fellowship of people who refuse to turn away when truth becomes costly. So what do you believe matters most after a night like this? Victory, justice, or memory? Whatever your answer, know this. You're not alone in asking. Somewhere, others are still keeping watch beneath the same rain.